want to have that every time I come onto a stage. I'm Paul Webley. I'm the Director of SOAS. I'd like to welcome you all in the audience tonight, particularly those who've travelled a long way to be here, and Trevor Marchand's partner, friends and colleagues. I know we have guests from all over. We have a full house here. We really appreciate you taking the trouble to be here tonight. Now, SOAS inaugurals are always wonderful, but tonight is particularly special as the inaugural lecture by Trevor is being combined with a concert by Lassana Diabate. You, in the audience, have already heard some wonderful music by him, but we were upstairs, so did not. But I'm looking forward to hearing the concert after the inaugural. After what I'm sure will be an insightful inaugural, there will be a short reception. I'll tell you this now so you can plan your evening, about 30 minutes, and then a half-hour concert. Now, I'm sure that this is going to be a very enjoyable event, but to make sure it is, I just need to do a couple of housekeeping things first. The first housekeeping thing is do please turn off your mobile phones. I'm sure Trevor will treat you very roughly if he hears any mobile phones going off. So I'm turning mine off, okay, just as... Right, I'm trying to turn mine off, but failing miserably. Let's try again. Oh, gosh. Right. Second thing, housekeeping. Do know where the fire exits are. No fire practice is planned for this evening. Even we are not cruel enough to do that to you, Trevor. So if the alarm does go off, please leave in an orderly fashion. Now, I'm very pleased to preside over this inaugural lecture, which is the second of a set of 4 inaugural lectures we have this term. I think it's going to be really fascinating. Trevor is an unusual academic in a number of ways. He trained as an architect, but works now as an anthropologist. He's a designer and maker of fine furniture, which I strongly recommend. He's made videos, he's put on exhibitions. He's a jack of all trades and master of them all, I would say. Even more unusual, when he came to see me a few years ago to complain about an error of judgment I had made, he did so with such warmth and humanity that I enjoyed the meeting, which I think is the first time I've enjoyed someone coming and complaining to me about something. So you can perhaps understand why, as Trevor is a great scholar and a great person, a person of great warmth, that I'm so looking forward to hearing what Trevor has to tell us about the anthropology of craft and craftspeople. Now, Professor Marchand, Trevor will be introduced by Professor John Peel, who's very well known to all of us here at SOAS. Professor Peel's research career began in the mid-1960s. I don't mind saying that because he said to me before the lecture, well, 4 decades ago this, 5 decades ago that, the other, with field research into indigenous African churches amongst the Yoruba of southwestern Nigeria. And for the first half of his career, he was identified as a sociologist rather than an anthropologist, with his first academic appointments in Nottingham and LSE. He was invited back to Nigeria in the mid-1970s to join a new department of sociology and anthropology. After 2 years, he returned to England to take up the post of Charles Booth, Professor of Sociology at Liverpool. And then finally, in 1989, he saw the light and he moved to SOAS. John has been a stalwart of SOAS. He's an FBA, he's been a dean, he's a world leader in African anthropology and sociology. So John will do the introduction. At the end, the vote of thanks will be given by another stalwart of SOAS. This is a very SOAS-y evening, Professor Richard Tapper. Professor Tapper taught and researched in SOAS, and unlike John, he saw the light early. He was here from 1967 to 2004. He made his career at SOAS, a very wise muse. Thank you very much, Richard. And like Professor Peel, he was head of the Department of Anthropology here. He's an anthropologist specialising in the nomadic peoples of Iran. He's the author of many, many books, including The Conflict of Tribe and State in Iran and Afghanistan and Frontier Nomads of Iran. He's also a founding member of the Afghan Refugee Information Network. We're both very grateful to them. We're very grateful to them both, I should say, for being part of today's events. Although I'm sure both Trevor and I are very grateful to them. My excuse is I only just got back from New York at midnight last night. I'm getting a bit muddled. So to introduce Trevor, I will now pass over to Professor Peel.
It's a very great pleasure, as well as a privilege for me, to have been asked by Professor Trevor Marchand to introduce his inaugural lecture this evening. Since I've known him since he first joined the department as a research student back in 1994. Now, 16 or 17 years later, he has completed the academic cursus honorum to attain the chair in social anthropology, which we celebrate today. People come to anthropology from a great diversity of backgrounds, but Trevor's is distinctly unusual in that when he joined us to do research on indigenous building practices, he was already a fully qualified architect, with at least 2 years of professional practice behind him, mostly designing houses for private clients in his native Quebec. The transition to his research career came about through an 18-month fellowship he was awarded by the Canadian International Development Agency to work on the use of indigenous building materials in Africa. This took him to Zaria in northern Nigeria, where there is a notable vernacular tradition of house building. And if I'm not mistaken, those are reliefs on the walls of one of the houses in Zaria. This must have really fired something in him, as the following year he enrolled as a research student at SOAS. Now, while the SOAS department is very proud to have produced Marchand the anthropologist, it has to be said that he's a somewhat atypical product. Nearly all work in anthropology today hinges on the intersection between a particular culture and a more general theme, such as religion, kinship, food, healing, migration, or whatever. And the aspiration of the subject is to use the culturally particular to shed light on what it is to be human, to be the kind of culture-bearing social animals that we are. SOAS anthropology is noted for the emphasis it places on the regional expertise of its members. And this shows in the commitment we have to teach ethnography courses covering 7 major regions of Asia and Africa. Most of us stay specialists in our region, and we range widely over different themes within it. Trevor is unusual in that he has already done major research in 3 different regions, and that his work is focused so strongly on one master theme, the nature of craft work. It is hard to believe that the empathy and penetration of his field research would have been what it is without his prior experience as an architect. Trevor's PhD thesis was the basis for his first book, Minaret Building Apprenticeship in Yemen, which addressed the question of how those beautiful lofty minarets, built in brick and stone, with elaborate decorative features that give such a distinctive character to the traditional landscapes of northern Yemen, can be created by small teams of craftsmen without the aid of architectural plans or drawings, and where little explicit instruction is given by the masters to their assistants and apprentices. In fact, Trevor became an apprentice himself. Happily, he has a good head for heights, as otherwise he might not have survived to tell the tale. For his next fieldwork, Trevor stayed in the Islamic world, but went to a very different part of it, the ancient city of Djenné, set in the floodplain of a tributary of the Upper Niger in the Republic of Mali. Here stands one of Africa's iconic buildings, the Great Mosque, reputedly the largest mud brick structure in the world, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. What he gives us in his last book, The Masons of Djenné, is many things, much more than a study of the technical, social, and even magical aspects of the building process. From the angle of its most famous building, it gives a vivid sense of Djenné both as an urban environment and as a community. It is beautifully written and carries its theories so lightly that it guides the reader easily into the life world of the Masons, whose human individuality emerges sharply from the narrative. Architectural drawings you expect, but not photographs as superb as those in the book, which many of you will have seen displayed on the landings of the school's main building. This book gained no less than 3 international prizes: the Herskovits Award of the African Studies Association in the United States, for the best work of its year across the whole field of African studies, the Elliot P. Skinner Book Award from the Association of Africanist Anthropologists, also in the US, and the Amory Talbot Prize for African Anthropology of the Royal Anthropological Institute here. But already Trevor is well launched on a third major project, this time based in England. In 2005, he was awarded a 3-year fellowship by the ESRC to work on building craft knowledge and apprenticeship in Britain. This has involved him training for the official qualification in fine woodwork at the Building Crafts College in Stratford, run under the auspices of the Carpenters Company of London. I imagine we will be hearing more about this shortly. But there is much more to Trevor than just the research scholar. He is what I would call a good department man, reliable and effective in administrative duties, almost as demanding of others as of himself, and a simply excellent teacher. Nowadays, there are more kicks than halfpence to being a head of department, it has to be said. But one cheering thing is to be able to read the students' appraisal reports on good teachers, of whom I'm glad to say the Anthropology department has many. Trevor's mastery of his subject matter, the care with which he delivers his courses, the clarity and above all the enthusiasm with which he delivers them, inevitably earns him the highest approbation from the students. I've come to esteem Trevor as greatly as a friend, as a colleague, and there's no time I find him so companionable as on our occasional architectural walks in London. It so happens I have an amateur interest in medieval architecture, church monuments, heraldry, and those kind of antiquarian things. So on our walks, while I supply the history, Trevor supplies the architecture to our conversations. What I've especially learnt from him, and it very much connects with the main theme of his research, is the importance of craftsmanship and how it shows up in the detail of a building, and also of understanding the limits and possibilities of the materials upon which a craftsman works. This seems to be an instance in microcosm of the interplay between culture and nature, which is at the heart of anthropological inquiry. An anthropological education, as we conceive it at SOAS, requires a critical acquaintance not just with the cultural forms of the worlds beyond Europe, but of the larger themes of European social theory since the Enlightenment. The title of Trevor's lecture today evokes for me a theme that runs persistently through the work of those thinkers who responded to the rise of industrial society. I think of Karl Marx, whose idea of what an unalienated social existence would be was based on the idea of homo faber, that is, man as craftsman. Or likewise Sigmund Freud, whom we think of as principally a theorist of human sexuality, who once said, when asked what the ends of human life were, Lieb und Arbeit, love and work. Is craftsmanship one way in which we seek to reconcile these polarities? Well, you've not come here to listen to me, so without more ado, let me invite Professor Trevor Marchand to deliver his inaugural lecture entitled The Pursuit of Pleasurable Work, an Anthropology of Craft and Craftspeople.
Merci, Lassana. My first vote of thanks goes to Lassana Jabate, who came all the way from Mali and is one of Africa's greatest musicians. And I'm so pleased that he came here for this event. And I also want to thank my very good colleague, Lucy Duran, for making all of that possible. Thank you, Lucy. Paul, thank you very much for your kind words. I've been at SOAS, as John said, for 17 years now, and I've seen several directors in charge of this institution. And I am so pleased that it is you that has introduced me this evening. I'm really honored by that. John, I also want to thank you very much for your introductory remarks. As John has said, not only are we colleagues, but we're also very good friends, and we share so many interests, not just in architecture, but also gardening. And I also share my gardening interests with Richard Tapper, who has very kindly agreed to say the closing word this evening. Richard was my supervisor, and our friendship has continued ever since, and I'm deeply honored that both of them have agreed to speak here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for being here this evening, and also my friends and colleagues. Payal, I want to thank you for organizing this along with Katie Nugent, and a special thanks to John Haywood and to my family for their continuous support. And finally, I want to thank the craftspeople that I've had the good fortune of working with over the years. I have immensely enjoyed their company. Let me begin. The pursuit of pleasurable work. Worthy work carries with it the hope of pleasure in rest, the hope of pleasure in our using what it makes, and the hope of pleasure in our daily creative skill. All other work but this is worthless. It is slaves' work, mere toiling to live, that we may live to toil. I tucked a mark between the pages, dropped the book gently to the floor next to my bed, and switched off the light. I peered wide-eyed and sleepless into the dark. The book's message was dispiriting, encapsulating what continues to be the reality for so many. William Morris first delivered his lecture on useful work versus useless toil on January 16th, 1884, to the Hampstead Liberal Club. In true socialist fashion, he rebuked the prevailing working conditions of industrial Britain that shackled a majority to a lifetime of drudgery, and he castigated the moral bankruptcy of a capitalist system built upon institutionalized inequality. Morris's fiery sermon warned of the dire, even bloody consequences of inaction. Regardless, mechanization triumphed around the globe, transforming potter, weaver, smith, farmer, and carpenter into assembly line worker in the pursuit of efficiency, economy of scale, and profit. Systematization and rationalization of the workplace did not end in the factory. Bureaucratic procedures in the now familiar guise of audit culture, benchmarking, total quality assessment, and key performance indicators have tightened their stranglehold around blue and white collar alike. Civil servant, police constable, NHS doctor, teacher, university administrator, and academic. Our mechanical submission to such faceless procedures gradually obscures the meaningful purpose of work and distances us from the creative pleasure of our labors. My fear of that loss instigated a long night of imaginative strategizing after I put down the book. The next morning, sleep-deprived but exhilarated, I set about composing my as yet fledgling ideas into a brand new study. A year later, in 2005, I set out on what would be my most pleasurable and in many ways most challenging field work to date, a project that meshed my intellectual pursuits as an anthropologist with a deep and persistent need to work with my hands. I signed up to a community of woodworkers in East London and engaged in the very training and politics of craft that I was investigating. This field work also allowed me to indulge in the activities that have stirred me most since youth, namely the design and making of things. As John told you, my first degree studies were in architecture. As a student, I had the good fortune of working summers as a building inspector and later of overseeing the construction of my own designs for large new homes in Montreal. During that work, I was regularly struck by the way that the site carpenters carried out often complicated tasks with a Spartan economy of words and, unnervingly, with brief and infrequent references to my carefully prepared drawings. There were clear discrepancies between the way I constructed buildings on paper, with engineering formulas and graphic conventions, and the way my designs were being realized on site. I recall observing a junior carpenter eyeballing his supervisor for cues while trying to emulate the old man's tool-wielding practices and procedures. I asked myself, how did communication, learning, and problem-solving take place in the joint activity of their physical work? This question drove me to anthropology, and I have worked and studied ever since alongside craftspeople, learning their skills while learning about their learning and their lives. Apprenticing as a means of inquiry is well suited to the study of learning in practical contexts where talking is upstaged by doing. It also encourages anthropologists to combine personal with scholarly interests and to acquire first-hand experience and possibly some level of expertise in the practices that they theorize and write about. Regular participation in what are sometimes monotonous and grueling exercises incites reflection on one's own learning, mistakes, and progress, as well as on the pains and pleasures that accompany physical labor. The exchange of toil for ethnographic knowledge forces anthropology to move beyond its traditional role as observer and interpreter of culture as text and to actively participate. This demands more transparent accountancy of the impact we have on our field sites and on the people with whom we study. It also makes plain that our field sites are not closed systems, but rather they are inextricably linked to the global exchange of people, goods, and ideas. My first fieldwork was carried out in the Hausa Emirate of Zaria in northern Nigeria with the support from the Canadian International Development Agency. That early study explored the planning, architecture, and flamboyant facades of the enormous extended family dwellings in the walled city and the array of associated mud building practices. I sat long hours with the master Sarkin Magina and his fellow masons, listening to their stories and filling my notebook with names and lineages, historic accounts of magical deeds, and colorful tales of meddlesome jinn spirits and of giant spiders that made ribbed dome ceilings. I learned very little, however, about how masons went about planning a new house in the absence of drawn plans, how they organized the complex geometries of mud-plaster designs for walls or erected vaults, or how any of this technical know-how was passed along to one generation to the next, and the younger generation, who were, for the most part, illiterate and innumerate, received no formal instruction and rarely, if ever, asked questions. Also limited were my insights into the politics of work, internal trade hierarchies, and the criteria by which the aesthetics and expertise were evaluated and contested. These gaps in my data signaled a need to shift the focus of future research from architecture as object to the engaged processes of building it. In the early 1980s, Yemen's capital, Sana'a, experienced a renaissance of minaret building activity financed by a surge in private wealth and affluence. Minarets there are typically built as freestanding structures separate from the prayer hall, and the act of endowing a mosque with such a costly structure is considered pious and merits blessing. By the time I began working with the Beit al-Maswari family of masons in the mid-1990s, they had secured a highly ranked position in the trade, and they were winning numerous commissions to erect minarets that far exceeded the heights of medieval ones within the walled city. Senani minarets are constructed from the inside out, so to speak, without the use of external scaffolding. Materials are transported by hand along spiraling staircases to masons who, perched precariously on top of rising walls, lay the kiln-baked bricks in beds of cement mortar. The various radii that compose the tower's changing dimensions and geometries as it rises are measured out with a nylon cord, knotted at fixed intervals and fastened to an axial steel post. And in fact, in this photo, you can see that there's a jacket that's laid on top of that steel post, and you can see the nylon cord as well. The post is embedded vertically at the core of the central masonry column, and its threaded ends allow for it to be incrementally extended throughout the entire height of the tower, ultimately piercing the domed roof to support a brass hilal, or crescent moon. The central column, the wrapping spiral staircase, and the exterior walls of the shaft are raised in tandem, all supported on deep foundations of dense basalt stone. In several respects, the physical assembly of the tower reflects the rigidly observed hierarchy among workmen. The lowly laborers prepare materials at ground level and man the length of the staircase to relay materials from bottom to top. The apprentice, stationed at the apex of that chain, neatly stacks supplies and hands them on cue to the masons who work squatting on the wall above. Among the masons, the most junior is responsible for infilling the thick masonry wall, while the smooth interior surface around the stairwell, requiring greater precision, is laid by the second in command. The complex decorative brickwork that covers the exterior surface, like a rug, is conceived and made by the master mason, and like him, it constitutes the most public face. Therefore, tasks and the degree of visibility of the finished work are therefore strongly correlated with rank. Indeed, as a tradesman progresses incrementally from the early stages of disciplined action to an encompassing understanding of design and building, he moves from handling and carving the smallest building units, the individual bricks, to making larger and more complex assemblies, like the spiral staircases, until finally he is capable of conceptualizing projects in their entirety and at all scales of construction. This denotes a master. The apprentice's position within the chain of command is tenuous. If he transgresses the rules of comportment, he is quickly removed from his privileged position working next to the masons. It is from that coveted spot that apprentices are exposed to the technical aspects and social politics of building, and from which trade knowledge can be stolen through careful observation, listening, and covert mimesis. Apprenticeship training lasts for a period of 5 years and longer, and during that time, an aspiring mason gradually gains the necessary skills and correct attitudes for one-day organizing projects and commandeering a labor force. After being declared a full-fledged mason, his mentoring continues under the yoke of a master, and he is delegated increasing autonomy until he finally establishes his own clientele and a degree of security within the highly competitive trade community. The making of a Senani mason is not simply a matter of technical proficiency. On minaret building sites, for instance, the master's engagement with clients and colleagues is typically informed by popular conceptions of Islamic piety and moral conduct. Speech, for instance, is regularly punctuated by Quranic verse and religious idioms. And work is scheduled to observe the midday prayer and the daytime fast during Ramadan. A giant brass insignia reading, "Masha'Allah, what God wills," is suspended from an iron chain, normally above the ground-level doorway of the minaret, offering God's protection for the workers on these dangerous building sites. Young tradesmen are heavily disciplined to respect authority, and every member dutifully plays his part in the machine-like assembly of routine activities, plying endless loads of bricks and mortar up and down his designated patch of the dark and dusty stairwell. Before embarking on their first commission for a small minaret, senior members of the Al-Maswari family meticulously surveyed one of the town's ancient landmark minarets. They confided to me that they had done so in order to better understand its structural principles. In negotiations with their patron, however, the Al-Maswari masons denied any such preparatory study and instead claimed that, as Yemeni builders, their knowledge was intuitive. They did not produce measured drawings, nor did they use mathematical formulas or ratios to achieve balanced composition. Instead, the master mason, or usta, judged the proportions to be correct when they filled his eye. He asserted confidently that knowledge was in his head, and he theatrically emphasized the point by pressing 4 fingers to his temples. Such claims serve to reinforce commonly held beliefs that skills are innate, and that the city's building tradition is conserved as mental templates by such experts. When asked to explain their skilled know-how and design expertise, however, language quickly met its limits, and the masons, like most craftspeople, resorted to demonstration. One late afternoon, sitting together at the top of the minaret and scanning Sanaa's ever-expanding horizons, the usta proudly distinguished his masons from other teams of construction workers as being taklidi, traditional. He went on to compare the enduring quality of their patterned brick creations with the ephemerality of the modern concrete structures that stretched out before us. It was clear that he derived immense pleasure and spiritual pride in knowing that what they built was for posterity. And this last slide is a picture of the first minaret that I built with the Al-Maswari family, and it measured 57 meters in height. Postdoctoral research took me back to West Africa, to a town I first visited in the 1980s. Nestled in a weave of gentle waterways around the Bani River, Djenné was once a powerful center of trade and Islamic scholarship. During the annual rains, the town becomes an island, naturally defended by a riverine network where local town residents fish and cultivate fields of rice and vegetables. Annual deposits of alluvial silts rich in myriad organic materials, including fish bone and manure from passing Fulani herds, are ideally suited to making mud bricks, mortar, and plasters of Djenné's world-renowned architecture. Djenné's equivalent of the Eiffel Tower or the Empire State Building is its Grand Mosque, reputed to be the largest single mud building in the world and famously depicted on postage stamps and postcards already beginning in the earliest years of French colonial administration. Together with the mosque, the ensemble of unique mud brick houses, densely organized in ancient residential quarters, has made this town an icon among UNESCO's Prime World Heritage Sites. 2 fieldwork seasons of constructing, repairing, and plastering mud houses, and subsequent annual visits with my Mason colleagues allowed me to consider the intricate combination of handiwork and social knowledge and the ways in which craft expertise is communicated on-site and across generations. Djenné's community of Masons is a gerontocracy, embodied in the guild-like association of the Barreton. Barre translates to builder or mason, and ton, a Mandé term, means association. The Masons Association is presided over by a chief, or barre-boumont, elected by his senior members. The Masons' trade and their corporate organization in Djenné is centuries old. Each household is contractually bound to an individual Mason or family of Masons, and these ties of patronage extend back through the generations. When Masons retire or die, they pass their clients on to sons, nephews, or selected disciples who apprenticed under them. Typically, the apprentice's first major test is to construct a brick wall. He must demonstrate the necessary skills for laying a perfectly vertical and well-supported structure. If there are any flaws, the wall is dismantled and he begins anew. If he succeeds, and he can do so repeatedly, the mason presents his apprentice with a plumb line. This elementary tool heralds the young man's rising status, but he's not promoted to the rank of mason for some time. Final judgment ultimately rests with his master. When deemed fully qualified to oversee duties autonomously, the master announces his decision at a Barreton meeting. He can anticipate, safely, that the association members will accept his judgment without objection. In fact, the decision concerning the young man's qualifications has been a shared one. As an apprentice circulates between projects and masons during his training, the members of this close-knit trade become familiar with the young man's skills and conduct, and in effect, they contribute collectively to his formation. Therefore, learning and personal formation are not encapsulated in a one-on-one master-apprentice relation, but rather they are manifested within the broader community of practitioners. Masons also teach trusted apprentices to recite benedictions that protect building team and work sites from harm, and that ward off dangerous spells cast by powerful Mason adversaries. Their benedictions and spells comprise a mix of Quranic-based Bai-Koré knowledge and Black African animist Bai-Bibi knowledge. And they may employ blessed objects and amulets in the laying of foundations and the constructions of walls. Over the course of his career, a capable mason accumulates a cache of secret rites performed to exorcise the land and buildings of evil jinn spirits and to guarantee the structural integrity of the edifices he erects. Magic and mortar are equally important to making safe buildings. In fact, in combination, masonry techniques, urban and ethnic lore, business skills, and secrets slowly forged the apprentice's practice and his professional identity as a member of that corporate community. The aesthetic principles of Djenné's architecture have remained remarkably consistent over the past century or longer, but the building tradition has by no means been static. Masons respond creatively to the changing needs, aspirations, and lifestyle choices of the inhabitants. This creativity is not one that reacts against and surpasses Djenné's characteristic architectural style, but rather one that remains responsive to it. It expands and embellishes the repertoire of possible architectural expression by producing its own articulation within the discursive boundaries of tradition. Such a creative ingenuity grasps tradition as a dynamic resource, not a static code of predetermined possibilities. After all, Djenné is a living, changing town. Masons and citizens alike take pride in its World Heritage status, but a host of obstructions continue to frustrate conservation efforts. Weak government and local leadership, abetted by fragile economics and conflicting development initiatives, and a harsh and unpredictable environment have impeded long-term planning for conserving the mud brick houses. But equally, Djenné's population has courted outside intervention cautiously, and they have tactically resisted the imposition of rules and regulations on their living environment. The residents, and the Masons included, struggle to participate in Mali's national project for progress and in the global arena for information. More than perhaps any town in the country, Djenné maintains a strong sense of continuity, but tradition and continuity, like in any place, are necessarily entangled in relations with modernity and change. I would just like to show you a brief film clip from a film that I made with Susan Vogel, and it gives you a sense of the activity that goes on in replastering the town's mosque each year. And it's not just the Masons that participate, but really every able-bodied man and child participates, and so do unmarried women.
I mugutigi man no i b'a kɛ I bi musiri I bi taa jita I bi fɛn bɛɛ kɛ mais tant que I furula kɔni muso kɔni ta kɛ mais cɛ kɔni tant que hali I furula I bi taa baara in kɛ.
This is the roof of the mosque.
parce que avec yoro do ya ko comme surulaw mais an yere fe Djenné an kon ta fe nta fe de an ba fe an kan ka am misiri mu parce que an muni am ma feti badi na mena mu du be de no nyaye moti ni kamalenu an yu de so hala dano mo widabla
Thanks, Jerry. If you could bring back the photos, that would be great. I should just say, too, I mean, normally after people see the film, they ask me, is there no health and safety in this place? And there is, because the Masons make their benedictions before the work commences. And then what you saw them doing at the end was, again, making final benedictions for the year ahead. Nobody is injured on that building site, miraculously. And they claim, well, of course they're not injured because we've made our benedictions. So health and safety is taken seriously. The masons I worked with in Sana'a and Djenné did not produce buildings according to an architect's template. Rather, these men were intimately involved in both the conceptualization and realization of form and space through their direct physical engagement in the act of making. In effect, ideas took shape in the coordinated activities of eyes, ears, hands, and tools. They typically employed locally available materials and indigenously developed technologies. Their structural knowledge was a tried and tested one, and importantly, their tuition was grounded in a practical apprenticeship rather than in institutional training. My research points to the fact that apprenticeship is not a unitary, unchanging system. Programs of training and learning, trade hierarchies and social relations between actors, and opportunities and trajectories for professional progress are all conditioned by the prevailing economics and political conditions of a time and place. Studies of skill learning illustrate that the structured environment of building sites does not merely reproduce stable communities and enduring practices, but more significantly, it accommodates improvisation, thoughtful innovation, and personal ambition. Indeed, craftspeople personalize work, foster individual reputations, and instantiate competitive hierarchies amongst themselves, which in turn incite change in styles, change in methods, and change in learning regimes. In its manifold forms, apprenticeship supplies a rounded education. It endows young people with the complex set of skills to innovatively reproduce dwellings, monuments, and urban landscapes to which residents attach shared meaning, identity, and a sense of ownership. Apprenticeship, learning, livelihood, and fulfillment therefore needs to be accorded the esteem it deserves, a subject I will return to shortly. In order to more fully consider the tensions between modernity and tradition, globalization and the politics of place, and useless toil versus worthy work, it became necessary to include a Western case study of craft training and practice within the scope of my comparative research. I therefore signed up as a full-time student on the two-year fine woodwork program at the Building Crafts College in Stratford, East London, training up in bench joinery and furniture making. The Building Crafts College was founded in 1893 by the Carpenters Livery Company to safeguard traditional trades against the sweeping changes wrought by industrialization and mass production. Though the college remit has changed over time, it retains a strong sense of its founding spirit, remaining committed to fostering craft excellence and perpetuating building craft traditions in wood, stonemasonry, and leadwork. Like the apprenticeship systems in Yemen and Mali, or an English woodcarver's training in the 17th century workshop of Grinling Gibbons, learning at the Building Crafts College remains first and foremost practice-based. My fieldwork set out to make a fine-grained study of woodworking practices, craft identities, and contemporary trends, politics, and economies in the trade. A second but equally important line of inquiry was made into the role of motor cognition in learning, planning, and communicating skilled practice on site, as woodworking instructor Con Lynch is doing here with the first-year cohort of trainees. I won't discuss this long-standing interest in great detail this evening, but the principal aim of that research is to contribute to a theory of human knowledge that begins from the premise that knowing is an emergent state of mind-body engaged in and with the environment. My thesis is grounded in a model of interactive alignment and significantly in the theory of dynamic syntax, developed by my linguistic colleagues Ruth Kempson and Lutz Martin, with others. In brief, dynamic syntax foregrounds a model of incremental online parsing to describe the cognitive processes involved in both interpreting and generating utterances. To date, work in dynamic syntax is focused on spoken dialogue, and very recently on music. My own research, however, explores its possible applications to the communication and production of skilled work, like the kind taking place here, where I'm working in close coordination with a fellow trainee to assemble a table, and with minimal exchange of words. Drawing inspiration from emerging theory and findings in the cognitive and neurosciences, I consider how complex imitation, like that performed by an apprentice learning a new skill alongside his master, involves parsing the master's display into a composite of familiar actions and sequences that can be reproduced, honed, and transformed. Parsing and generating movement, I argue, occurs principally in our motor domains of cognition. In other words, interpreting, understanding, and even mentally rehearsing skilled activity are seated in the very same neural networks that spring us into action. My research on embodied cognition and communication has led me most recently to ponder the relation between brain, hand, and tool. This relation is at once evolutionary, physical, neurological, psychological, cultural, and social in nature, and I believe it holds the key to what makes us human. Hands are an important medium for expressing and even shaping ideas and emotions, either on their own or more typically in coordination with utterance, facial expression, gaze, or posture. The hand, too, is the most effective appendage for manipulating objects and for configuring and modifying our physical environment. My specific concern lies with the nature of skilled hand tool use. Tools are cultural artifacts that possess their own history of use and shared meaning, and through practice we are, so to speak, socialized in the tool. In turn, mastering a tool modifies and expands our integrated cognitive and physical abilities. For a moment, imagine yourselves, I'm asking you, imagine yourselves, not just visually in your mind's eye, but physically, with your body. Try to imagine engaging in the very same task that this woodworker is engaged in the photograph, using a chisel and a mallet and carving out a channel in wood. Skilled handwork involves fast and fluid exchanges of various kinds of sensory information, motor action feedback, semantic knowledge. It also involves reflective thought on goals, present actions, and tasks completed. When this exchange of action, information, and thought is synchronized, woodworkers experience a sense of unity to what they see, hear, and feel and do with tools and materials. Like athletes, the carpenters I trained with referred to this experience as being in the zone, or the zen of woodworking. Body, mind, and soul absorbed in the task. Indeed, recent studies demonstrate that at a physical and neurological level, a hand tool becomes an extension of the forearm, hands, and fingers, and thereby integrated within a brain-hand-tool complex. Our ability to conceptually identify and understand the uses of a wide variety of tools, to plan with tools and satisfy goals, and to manipulate tools with high levels of manual dexterity is a defining trait of our species and merits greater study. I believe that anthropology's involvement in exploring the everyday manifestations of this remarkable union is essential to the growth and development of the discipline's authority in the related fields of craft, skill, technology, work, and sport, and to anthropology's ongoing contribution to the fields of medicine and cognitive neurosciences. American neurologist Frank Wilson correctly observes that for a great number of people, the hand becomes the critical instrument of thought, skill, feeling, and intention for a lifetime of professional work. I would add that skilled handwork lends practitioners a vital sense of agency to make, undo, repair, and transform their world and the world of others in immediate, practical, hands-on ways. The pursuit of pleasurable work is indeed the pursuit of such agency. One group of trainees at the Building Crafts College I coined the vocational migrants. Demographically, they comprised a mix of mature men and women, many of whom would be described socioeconomically as middle class. All had abandoned professional careers or other steady employment for what they perceived to be a more fulfilling vocation and lifestyle. Ultimately, they longed to escape the atomizing effects of globalization and explore the possibility of new subjectivities that promised greater control over their daily work. It was felt amongst them that a clear, unambiguous connection exists between the fine woodworker and their environment of tools, materials, and the marketplace that they serve. And they largely shared a progressive green politics concerning sourcing and sustainability of resources. Despite the very real risk of poor wages and underemployment, the choice of woodwork was consistently justified by trainees as satisfying and meaningful. Carpentry was perceived to be a wholesome profession that was somehow rooted in humankind's early cultural beginnings and basic needs. It was repeatedly construed as noble and honest, and I'm using the words that people used over and over again in the interviews, uncorrupted by modernity's rational division of labor, technological abstraction, speed, placelessness, and alienation from the meaning and value of work. By relocating the self within an imagined heritage of craft production and embodying the ethos of a future utopia that promises satisfaction and actualization, my fellow vocational migrants were ultimately striving to realize an aesthetic integration of work with life, a harmonious balance of autonomy with communal responsibility, and crucially, a unity of mind, body, and spirit. The spiritual dimension of carpentry was beautifully expressed by bench joinery instructor Jim O'Brien. Jim teaches the cohorts of mainly young trainees enrolled on the government's apprenticeship scheme offering NVQs in wood occupations on behalf of the Construction Industry Training Board. He told me, "We're teaching them professional formation. If you want to use the terminology, we're using a holistic approach here. We don't just feed one sense, we're going across the whole person. When you get them in the first year, they're a pimply 16, 4-foot-nothing Lilliputian. And when the 3 years are up, they're 6'2" and wide as you like. And they've not just grown in body, they've grown spiritually and mentally as well. I'm not talking about religious spiritual. The craft is spiritual, if you like. Our pride is a spiritual thing. It's a question of, I done it. I don't care who knows, I know. That's the spiritual bit." At tea and in the pub, daily discussions and debates turn to world issues, the environment, and the place of craftwork in today's economy. The unhappy reality for most fine woodworkers is that the path to making a secure living is riddled with obstacles. I have time remaining to mention just a few of these. To begin with, the costs involved in setting up a workshop with the necessary complement of tools and machinery, hiring workspace, purchasing a delivery vehicle, and financing monthly overheads are prohibitively high. The minimum cost for the basic tools and machineries, minimum, alone exceeds £10,000. If setup costs can be overcome, the next looming obstacle is the market. That's us. Mass-produced fittings, imported furniture from Eastern Europe and Asia, often of very good quality, and flat-pack DIY kits are readily available at affordable prices from the nation's favorite home stores. This merchandise meets the needs and tastes of the vast majority of us. High-quality joinery and bespoke furniture making, on the other hand, are trades relatively isolated from the wider economy, serving mainly elite patrons and difficult-to-access niche markets. The time and effort that goes into designing and crafting handmade objects normally keeps the pricing in a band of its own, and even those individuals and institutions with the capital to afford it are reluctant to invest, and perhaps more so, to take the aesthetic risk of commissioning something entirely unique. Risk aversion on the part of consumer and industry is far from new. David Pye, professor of furniture design at the Royal Academy of Arts, wrote in 1968, "The building trade is in transition in this country from the workmanship of risk to that of certainty, to the assembly of prefabricated components so made that neither care, knowledge, nor dexterity are required for their assembly. And such trades as the joiners are in decline. There are now too few good joiners." Concern about the nation's skill gap has been flagged for decades by both government and the construction industry, and numerous schemes have been piloted with limited success. England's historic attachment to laissez-faire economics keeps that gap wide. There has been a lack of political will to commit wholeheartedly to vocational training, and despite the launch of the government's apprenticeship scheme in 1993, the UK continues to pander to global market forces that justify the import of cheaper labor to the detriment of homegrown skill. Woodwork instructor Cheryl Matty poignantly summarized the state of affairs for me in 2008. The question of whether our craft has a future in the UK is difficult, isn't it? To me, it's quite depressing to think about the Olympics coming to Stratford. This borough is one of the poorest in Britain, and here we are, the Olympics are coming to town. It's almost as if you're a bit of a traitor if you're not excited about it. But what I see is that it won't include local craftspeople. It's going to be steel, it's going to be aluminum, it's going to be glass and plastics. It's going to be quick, and it's going to be as cheap as they can get away with without it looking cheap. It's going to have a face value for the amount of time that the Olympics are on, and then after that, Stratford can go back to being Stratford. It was summed up when they hung the baskets of flowers around Stratford Station for the Olympic Committee visit, and the next day they took them all away. They didn't even give them away to people in Stratford. So they didn't even wait until the flowers died. They just took them away. So you know that there's not going to be time and effort put into training people to use natural materials and to go into craft for a months-long Olympics. That's not going to happen. It's going to take the same direction that the industry's already headed. Everything's going to be prefabricated in cheaper countries, flat-packed and assembled on-site by semi-skilled people who might be one-trick ponies. That doesn't leave any room for crafts, does it? That doesn't leave room for anybody in Stratford to say, see that bit on telly there? I made that. And to be proud of what they've done. In the past, craftspeople could point to a detail 3 stories up on a building and say, I did that because I could, and because I'm proud of it. I know it's there and that's enough. Finally, one of the biggest hurdles deterring potentially talented woodworkers from pursuing the necessary vocational training is the persistent popular notion that the trades are a refuge for academic underachievers and members of the social underclasses. This poses one of the most serious hurdles to recruitment, both in terms of numbers and quality of candidates. Again, I offer you Cheryl's shrewd observations. Sorry, let me just go back. Parents don't really want their boys going into carpentry because of the lack of value placed on working with your hands. That attitude is traditional, and it's been that way since at least the 1950s. If those who are less academically able are pushed into the industry, then it's a bit like wearing a dunce's hat, isn't it? Who wants to be a chippy if a chippy is looked on as someone who's just too thick to do maths? That stigma stays attached to the manual trades, at least for boys. There isn't the same stigma for women because, frankly, there's just no history of them at all in the trade. That's changing. For those at the helm of educational policy and curriculum planning, for those who teach, and for those of us who study skill, it is imperative that definitions of knowledge and intelligence be reconceptualized and expanded. In the spirit of William Morris, John Dewey, and others, contemporary educationalist Mike Rose writes, "To acknowledge our collective capacity is to take the concept of variability seriously. Not as slots along a simplified cognitive continuum or as neat high-low distribution, but as a bountiful and layered field where many processes and domains of knowledge interact." As I hope my studies with masons and carpenters show, skill acquisition is not unthinking imitation. Embodied learning involves multiple and highly complex forms of communication, and like propositional knowledge, skilled practice is a hard-earned cognitive achievement. The knowing body has, for too long, been underestimated, undervalued, and misunderstood, in part because of the limits of language for describing and objectifying what it is we know how to do. Today, cognitive studies, neurosciences, philosophy of mind, education studies, and ethnographic fieldwork are providing fresh insights into embodied ways of learning and knowing. The modern history of Western education has narrowly focused on conceptual thinking. Enduring Platonism and the Enlightenment's high pedestal to reason have marginalized the body, and the pedagogies of formal schooling have systematically confined physical forms of learning to regimes of disciplined training. By contrast, I claim that it is with bodies, and not merely words, that people learn, express, interpret, improvise, and negotiate, in a word, craft, their ways of knowing and living in the world. Fieldwork with craftspeople reinforces the idea that the body is a prime site for establishing a rounded education for social citizenship. Like craft apprenticeship, all learning and work should be embedded in a framework that scaffolds a lifelong pursuit of physical, intellectual, and spiritual development. Thank you.